Hi guys and welcome to another devcast. Today I'm going to talk about Dash, and to be more precise I'm going to talk about the new features and the refactoring of variables inside Dash 0.6.4. As I mentioned in my previous Machina video, I did some changes how variables work in that framework, and I merged it into Dash, and during this process I also came up with some new features that I will introduce today. So currently in Dash you had basically two type of variables. One was a graph variable, which is a variable that's stored inside the graph. It's serialized with the graph, and the second type was global variables, which was a single component. It was a global variable controller on any object in the scene, which basically then set on the core that these are the global variables. You could only have the single controller, single global variables controller in the scene, and those variables were global. Uh, the global variable controller no longer exists. It kind of got merged into these new features that I'm going to talk about, and so let's jump right into it. In the standard workflow, most of us use it. When we use the instanced or bound graph on a controller, we don't really think about the variables because the graph and the controller is basically the same. It's bound to the instance. It's not the two separate entities. It's serialized together. So that's why I added in some of the previous versions that you are able to edit these variables, these graph variables inside the controller as well. So if I just change this variable, it will automatically change here. The issue with this is that if we switch our workflow to use the non-bound or the asset graphs, this becomes an issue. So let me show you. When I switch to this asset graph, which is the same as the bound graph, the logic I created it, but now it's an asset graph, and we have this graph variable inside it, and we can edit it here. Basically, by default now with 0.64, you will not see the editation of graph variables inside the controller by default. I added this explicit toggle that you want to edit graph variables, and here is why. Because these are the variables of the graph, which is an asset. They are not bound to the controller. So you also see this warning, these are not bound to the instance. What this means that if I create another controller and I use the same graph, and I change this variable to, let's say, 5, and I go to the other controller that uses it, you will see that the variable got changed because these are the graph variables. They are stored with the graph itself. They are not stored inside the dash. And this may be an issue if you just work with it as a bound or instance graph. This by default I disabled the option to edit these variables on the controller because it gets people thinking that these are somehow bound to the instance. They are not. So how to solve this? I've introduced when I want an instance variables, basically when working with the graph variables, when working with asset graphs. I introduced a new controller. It's called the dash variables controller, and you see these are controller variables. So when I add a variable here, let's make it a float, and let's call it test because you cannot have the variables of the same name inside a single variables instance. So the graph cannot have basically two variables with the same name, but you can have the same name inside the controller variables. You can basically override the variable that's inside the graph variable. So when the expression evaluator will look for a variable, it will look for a controller variables first. So basically you can have these variables as some kind of default values, and then you can have your controller variables or the instance variables like taking over during a runtime. So if I run this, let's call this test one for now, and I have this very simple graph with a single input and a debug that basically debugs the test variable. So I'll run it. We will see in our debug window as well as a dash debug console that the result is 5. If I name this variable test, which is the same as the graph variable, and I run it, the result will be 0 because, as I said, this has priority over the graph variables. There is also this toggle or a switch to make these variables global. And what this does is very similar what the dash global variable controller did, but it is more robust at the moment because you can make any variables global, even multiple instances of these variables. This no longer makes this instance as a single global variable list. It will add all the variables from this controller into a global stack, so all of them will be there. If there is a name of variable already used that was previously added, it will skip adding of the new variable. I will probably introduce some kind of warning that you are trying to add two variables of the same name. I can even introduce some kind of flag overriding that if it is, for example, same type, I will override it. If it's not the same type, I will let you know, or something like that. So you can make global any variables. But this is not all. I introduced some other features because some of you that work with Odin serializer know that working with prefabs are not that straightforward, basically. And you cannot override or you cannot have a partial modification of Odin serialized stuff in or the dash graph or the dash variables as well. So if I made a prefab out of this, wouldn't be able to have a prefab with like okay, let's say we want two variables, and I cannot make a prefab out of this and have the prefab override just this variable. So this was a limitation. Uh, I am waiting basically since now we have decoupled the serialization of the variables from the serialization of the graph or of the controller itself. This is separate, but still the Unity default serialization doesn't really uh, is not robust enough to help us because variables are generic types. And even though Unity can serialize generic types, it cannot serialize inflated types, which is basically all the variables because all of them are inflated. They have some basic type that then they are later inflated to like variable, float, variable, integer, and so on. And currently Unity doesn't support serialization of inflated types. So that's a limitation. Once it does, I can basically switch this serialization of variables to Unity serialization itself, and if that serialization supports the prefab modifications, it will automatically be supported out of the box. So let's wait for Unity engineers and let's hope. But for now, what I introduced is that this variable controller can be extended, and it has some cool features that once you extend it. And let me remove this one, and let me introduce the test controller, which is, or not this, not the one, it is the test variables controller or test variables, which is the one that will show you. There is no longer the UI because the basic UI with the dash graph and the variables is bind to the dash variables controller only, and you don't really want it for this because what I introduced is that when you inherit the dash variables controller during awake, it will look for all public properties inside of that component, and it will create variables out of them. So now we have this property, which is test property. Let me show you, which is just this. We are extending the dash variables controller. We have this test property, which is 5. So uh, now when I make it 1, because I want it different than the graph variables, and I run this, you will see that it's 5, because now this, since it inherited the dash control variables, it is a variable, it is a valid variable holder inside the controller, and if the expression evaluation is looking for variables, it will find an instance-based variables, which is this, since we inherited the controller. And as I mentioned, the variable controller has this neat feature that uh, during awake or initialization, it will, because initialization, for example, for preview states in dash graphs are not on awake because there is no awake in the preview inside an editor. But that's a different topic. We basically enumerate all the fields, all the public fields on that instance, and create variables out of them. I may introduce some kind of attribute, specific like variable or something like that, to make it more granular. But at the moment, all the public, which basically are serialized by Unity, public variables will be, or properties will be variables. So what this means, it will address our issues with prefabs, because this is perfectly modifiable inside your prefabs, and you can have prefab variants with different variables, and during awake they will get enumerated into the variables themselves. I may even introduce an option that not only they will be enumerated during awake, but I will store the reflection pointers, the field infos for the original properties. So when they get evaluated, it will get the values directly from the properties themselves. At the moment, they are evaluated during the bind or the fetch during the awake, just for optimization. But it's very easy for me to add this feature at the moment, and even for performance reasons, I'm storing the values or cache the values. So, and one more feature I want to mention, uh, the variables are now, if you want to implement yourself, for example, you cannot extend the controller. The variables are now interface. The expression evaluator is working with it as an interface. So if you want to have, and it's looking for a component based on that interface when on the controller. So you want to have your own custom component that should be used as a variable holder, then you can implement this interface. It has a simple 4 methods to adjust overloads anyway, and it's a has variable, get variable, and a generic get variable. And there is this initialization, which is handy if you want to, for example, override the functionality that the variables, the instance variables, are by default bound to the game object that they are on, because by default this will be basically where the controller is. It's for the variable binding, because you can, as you know, you can bind variable values to properties, which is very similar to what I'm doing here, but that is actually using the reflection. This will just automatically do a lot of stuff for you, but you can manually bind it to a specific uh, property on the controller. So if I, for example, wanted to have a component that would be able to bind my variables to a different game object than this one, I can use it. I can do it using the custom eVariables implementation. So that's all for how I'm approaching variables from the upcoming version. If you have any questions, just let me know. And I will see what I can do. Also, if there are any issues you may perceive in this, how I have implemented it, I'm all ears because I tested it. I pinged also some people that use Dash extensively, and for now this is the road I've chosen. So we'll see. And thanks for now.